Somewhere in the 3rd millennium BC, something changed. The gods who once walked among kings who appointed rulers, toppled cities, and spoke like they had skin in the game went quiet. The texts don't really explain it. They don't give us a big dramatic farewell. They just stop describing divine presence and start describing memory, ritual, tradition, interpretation. And before we go any further, let me be crystal clear about what this is and what it isn't. This is not a ancient aliens pitch. This isn't a promise that we're about to uncover a spaceship in a ziggurat. This is something much stranger and honestly much harder to dismiss. A question that the evidence keeps asking, even when we try to ignore it. What happened at the top of history that forced the old order to collapse? Because if you take the Sumerian king list seriously as a document, as a record, as a piece of political memory, then it reads like a timeline that breaks in half. Before the flood, it says rulers governed for 28,800 years, then 36,000, then 43,200. 8 kings total, reigning for 241,200 years across 5 cities before everything gets wiped. After the flood, the same list keeps going, but now the reigns are decades, not millennia, not cosmic spans, decades, human lengths. And here's the part that should make you sit up. It's the same kind of writing, same bureaucratic tone, same scribal rhythm, same accountant voice etched into clay. No poetic warning. No, and now we speak in metaphor. Just names, cities, numbers like a ledger. And that's where it starts to feel disturbing, because the list doesn't frame the flood like a moral punishment for human evil. It doesn't say people sinned, so the gods got angry. Instead, in the stories that match this timeline, especially the Epic of Atrahasis, the flood reads like a reset, a fix, an intervention meant to solve a management problem. And the problem wasn't that humans were wicked. The problem was that humans were too many, too loud, too chaotic, too numerous to control. Atrahasis puts it almost bluntly. The gods couldn't sleep because humanity had multiplied beyond control. The noise rigmu, the word the text uses, was unbearable. Not poetic noise, not symbolic noise. The clamour of a population that won't stop growing. So here's the question I want you to hold in your mind as we go. What if the disappearance of the Anunnaki from the historical record isn't about abandonment, but about collapse? What if humanity didn't lose the gods? What if the gods lost us? And the wild thing is, the evidence for this isn't hidden in some forbidden archive. It's been sitting in museums, universities, and excavation reports for over a century. One of the most important pieces is a small object with a massive shadow, the Weld-Blundell prism. It's a 4-sided clay prism, not much bigger than a modern book, excavated in 1922 from the ruins of Lhasa in southern Iraq. When scholars translated its cuneiform text, they found something that still makes historians uncomfortable, not because it's mystical, but because it's written like bureaucracy. It's a king list, and it treats mythological figures and verifiable historical rulers with identical administrative precision. It begins with a line that modern archaeology still doesn't know where to file. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not people invented kingship. Not they chose a leader. It descended from heaven, as if political authority arrived from the outside, complete and functional, like a system being installed. Then the text names 8 kings, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmen Luana, and 5 others, ruling across 5 cities for a combined total of 241,200 years. And then comes a single sentence that changes everything. Then the flood swept over. No dramatics, no thunder, no warning, just that. And then the list continues. New cities, new dynasties, new kings, and now the reigns shrink, not slightly violently, first centuries, then lifetimes, then lengths that start matching what archaeology can actually verify. Most famously, it includes Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, a figure whose name appears in multiple independent sources, whose city walls have been physically excavated, and whose reign many scholars place around 2700 BC. So here's the problem. A very simple problem, but one that refuses to go away. If the post-flood section is historically reliable, why do we automatically dismiss the pre-flood section? It's the same document, same scribal tradition, same tone, same matter-of-fact delivery. There's no shift in genre, no change in style, no note telling you, by the way, everything before this is symbolic. It's just names, cities, and numbers. And I know some of you are already thinking, come on, those numbers are obviously fake. Okay, sure, but then we have to deal with the deeper issue. Fake in what way? Because these numbers aren't random exaggerations. They aren't messy or chaotic. They're calculated. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60 mathematics, and one of their biggest time units was the Sa, equal to 3,600. Now, look at the antediluvian reigns again. Alulim, 28,800 years. That's 8 Rial. Alalgar, 36,000 years. That's 10 Rial. And Menluana, 43,200 years. That's 12 Rial. Over and over, the reigns land on clean multiples of 3,600. That's not drunken myth-making. That's deliberate structure. It's someone recording time in a system they believed made sense, even if it doesn't make sense to us. So, what are we looking at? There are two broad possibilities. 1. The numbers are symbolic. They represent eras, dynasties, cycles, something like ages, not literal lifespans. But if that's true, why attach those lengths to specific named rulers, ruling from specific named cities, and present it all with the same administrative tone used for kings we can verify? Why totals? Why accounting? 2. These rulers weren't human in the way we mean human. Not necessarily aliens, don't jump there yet, but something other in the cultural memory. Something closer to divine administration. Authority that didn't originate from people, but descended onto people. Because that opening phrase isn't decoration, after the kingship descended from heaven. For the Sumerians, political authority wasn't something humanity invented, it was delivered from above, and according to their own records, it didn't stay forever. If you zoom out, the king list isn't just a lineup of rulers, it's a record of a system collapsing. Early rulers, reigns measured in vast spans. Later rulers, reigns measured in centuries. Post-flood rulers, reigns measured in decades. That pattern looks less like fantasy and more like decline, like loss of control, like something slipping away. And in Atrahasis, the text that mirrors this worldview, the flood, isn't a moral story. It's policy, it's population control, it's the final tool in a toolkit that isn't working. Plague didn't work, famine didn't work, drought didn't work. People survived, rebuilt, multiplied again, and this time, the gods didn't come back to rule. Kingship remained on earth, managed by humans, legitimated through ritual, temple systems, and inherited memory, not presence. So the question isn't, were the Anunnaki real? The real question is, what exactly is preserved in these texts? A memory of divine governance? Or a memory of governance by someone, something that humanity eventually outgrew, resisted, outlasted, or simply became too big to control. If you're into historical mysteries that mess with clean timelines, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. And as always, the visuals are just context. The real evidence is in the ancient record. Get comfortable. Let's begin back in 1922 with a small clay prism pulled from the ruins of Lhasa and a list of kings that reads like history, right up until it doesn't. Let's go back to 1922. Herbert Weld Blundell's excavation team is working at Lhasa, one of the major cities of ancient Sumer in what is now southern Iraq. Most digs like this produce what you'd expect from an early civilization: grain receipts, tax records, temple inventories, hymns, maybe a contract or two. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia are often brutally practical. They're the paperwork of the first bureaucratic world. So when they pull a small four-sided prism from the rubble, covered in tight, neatly arranged cuneiform, nobody's expecting anything dramatic. It's just another piece of clay with writing, until it's translated, and instead of a receipt, they get a ledger of kingship. Not a poem, not a myth, not a story with monsters, gods, and cosmic metaphors. A list, names, cities, reign lengths, totals, written like an accountant. That tone matters more than almost anything else in this entire mystery, because tone tells you how the writer wants to be understood, and whoever carved this prism wanted it to read as record, as official sequence, as legit political memory. The scribe doesn't entertain you, he doesn't persuade you, he just documents. And what he documents should not exist. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, reigned 28,800 years. The second, Alalgar, reigned 36,000 years. The third, Omenuana, reigned 43,200 years. And it keeps going like that. 8 kings, 5 cities, a combined total of 241,200 years. Then, without drama, without explanation, the line appears, then the flood swept over, and after that, the list continues. New kings, new cities, new dynasties, and suddenly the reigns shrink, not to normal immediately, but to something different hundreds of years, then less again, until eventually you're reading a sequence that starts to line up with what archaeology can actually confirm. This is where the paradox becomes impossible to ignore, because historians didn't find the prism and say, okay, the whole thing is accurate. The immediate response was dismissal, the antediluvian section. Everything before the flood was labelled mythological, symbolic, legendary, and in a sense, that makes perfect rational sense. Human beings don't reign for tens of thousands of years, so the numbers must mean something else. But here's what's awkward. The document doesn't behave like it's switching modes. It doesn't go from myth to history in a way that screams it at you. It just keeps listing. Same formula, same grammar, same scribal rhythm. So when we dismiss the pre-flood kings, we're not doing it because the text tells us to. We're doing it because we have to. And that creates a strange kind of selective reading. We accept the part that matches our expectations and reject the part that doesn't, even though the document itself presents both as equally factual. Now, if the king list ended at the flood, we could shrug and say, it's just a mythical timeline. But it doesn't end. It carries straight through into the era where names begin appearing in other records, administrative tablets, inscriptions, hymns, archaeology, ruins you can touch. And then comes the hinge figure, Gilgamesh. Most people hear Gilgamesh and think legend, a hero, a mythic king on a quest. But Gilgamesh doesn't live in only one place. He appears in the Sumerian King List, the Epic of Gilgamesh, independent Sumerian poems, administrative references tied to Uruk's early dynastic period, and whether Gilgamesh was one historical king or a composite that absorbed multiple rulers into one legendary identity, the city he ruled, Uruk, is absolutely real, excavated, mapped, stratified, dated. Its walls and temple complexes aren't theoretical, they exist in dirt and stone. So you're left with a deeply uncomfortable question. If the post-flood section includes rulers connected to real archaeological chronologies, then what exactly is the pre-flood section? Because you can't just call it fiction and move on without explaining why the scribes placed it in the same administrative framework. And it gets even stranger once you realize those impossible reign lengths aren't random at all. Remember the sexagesimal system, base 60. The Sumerians didn't count time the way we do. Their math shaped how they measured the world, and one major unit in their time system was the Sa, equal to 3,600 years. Now watch what happens when you translate those reigns into Sa, 28,000. 800 years equals 8 Rial. 36,000 years equals 10 Rial, 43,000. 200 years equals 12 Rial. This isn't a king list throwing out big numbers for dramatic effect. This is a list using precise multiples. It's almost as if it's encoding a system like the reign lengths are officially measured in units that aren't meant to match human lifespans, which raises two different ways to interpret what the scribes were doing. Possibility 1. Symbolic chronology. The standard academic answer is that these numbers represent eras, not individuals. They could be dynastic blocks, cosmic cycles, or a way of saying, this king belongs to an age beyond human time. But if that's the case, then why attach those spans to named individuals ruling from specific cities? Why not say, the age of Eridu lasted X, Sa? Why create a list of kings at all? And why keep the administrative tone? Because if you're writing a myth, you have tools for myth-making, poetic flourishes, divine commentary, cosmic framing. This list doesn't do that. It's restrained, cold, almost. Possibility 2. A different category of ruler. The second possibility is harder to talk about responsibly because it invites wild speculation if you're not careful. But here's the safe, evidence-based version. Maybe the antediluvian kings aren't described as human rulers because the memory being preserved isn't about humans ruling humans. It's about kingship itself, arriving from somewhere above and existing in a different mode before the flood. That opening line matters again. After the kingship descended from heaven. That's not how you describe a social invention. That's how you describe an installation, a transfer, a delivery of authority from an external source. And according to the king list, that external source never delivers kingship again in the same way. Because after the flood, the pattern changes permanently. What comes after the flood is movement. Kingship becomes something that shifts from city to city, Kish, then Uruk, then other centers as dynasties rise and fall. The list starts recording not an eternal divine order, but political contest. And as the contest intensifies, reign lengths shrink, which makes the overall shape of the document feel like this: a long, stable, impossible era before the flood, a catastrophic rupture, a shorter, unstable era after the flood, a steady slide into recognizable human history. And at the center of it all is the flood, not as a moral punishment, but as a dividing line where one model of governance ends and another begins. This is where I want to pause and underline something important. The Sumerian king list wasn't preserved as a curiosity. It was copied and recopied for centuries, Scribes in different cities maintained it, edited it, updated it, because it was politically useful. King lists weren't history in the modern sense. They were legitimacy documents. To be included in the list was to be recognized. To be excluded was to be erased. So, think about the implications. If the antediluvian section was obviously meaningless to the scribes if it was just myth fluff, why preserve it so consistently? Why begin your legitimacy chain with kings no one could verify? Why anchor political authority in figures with reigns that, even to ancient minds, would have been beyond normal human measurement? The simplest answer is, because they believed that section mattered. Because it was foundational. Because without it, kingship becomes just a human arrangement. But with it, kingship becomes something older than any dynasty, something that originated in heaven and was handed down. And now the real tension starts to come into view, because if the list is a political document designed to legitimize kings, why does it openly document decline? Why does it preserve the shrinking of reigns as you move forward? Why does it preserve the idea that the old order, whatever it was, didn't last? If its only function was propaganda, it should claim stability, continuity, eternal divine support. Instead, it records a world getting smaller, shorter, more human. Which brings us to the part where the king list stops being the strangest thing in the corpus and becomes the doorway into something even more unsettling. Because the king list doesn't exist alone. It sits beside a whole set of texts that describe the same problem from different angles. Humans multiply. The system can't scale. The gods implement control measures. Those measures fail. A flood is authorized as a reset. Humanity survives. And after that, direct divine governance never returns. And that story, more than any reign number, is where the real mystery lives. So next, we're going to move into the text that says the quiet part out loud. The one that doesn't describe the flood as punishment, but as policy. The one that admits the gods weren't angry at human evil, they were overwhelmed by human growth. Chapter 3. The Management Crisis. When humans become too many. The Management Crisis. When humans become too many. Here's where the story stops sounding like myth and starts sounding like a report nobody wanted to file. Because if the Sumerian king list is the skeleton of this mystery, the Epic of Atrahasis is the nervous system. It doesn't just mention the flood, it explains the logic behind it, and not in a moral, humans were evil kind of way, in a this system is failing kind of way. In 1965, scholars published a full translation of an old Babylonian tablet catalogued as British Museum 78941, containing one of the most complete versions of Atrahasis. The text itself was written around 1800 BC, but it clearly preserves older traditions that stretch back centuries earlier, possibly into the early 3rd millennium. And what does it open with? Not a grand creation scene, not a serene council of gods, a labor dispute. Before humans exist, the gods are doing the work of civilization themselves, digging canals, dredging rivers, maintaining irrigation. The text describes the lesser gods, often called the Igigi, performing the heavy labor under the authority of the senior gods, the Anunnaki. And for a while, they take it. Then they break. They rebel. They burn their tools. They surround the house of Enlil, the chief authority figure in this story, and they refuse to keep working. It's not framed like cosmic rebellion in the Satan fell from heaven sense. It's framed like a workforce revolt, and Enlil, along with the rest of the divine leadership, has a problem. How do you keep the system running if the labor force quits? The solution is humanity, and the text is blunt about why humans are created. Humans aren't created as a blessing. They're created as a replacement workforce. There's a line in Atrahasis that lands like a stamp on the whole narrative. Let man assume the drudgery of God. That's the premise. Humans are engineered, crafted, assigned, deployed to take over labor. The divine system can't sustain internally. And for a time, it works. Humanity builds, farms, hauls, digs, produces. Then humanity does what populations always do when conditions allow. It multiplies. Atrahasis describes the growth like a clock ticking. Time passes 1,200 years in the text structure, and the human population expands until something changes in the divine council's tone. And then comes the line that defines the entire crisis. The land became wide. The people became numerous. The land bellowed like a wild ox. The god was disturbed by their uproar. That word rigmu matters. It means clamour, racket, uproar. Not just noise like background sound, the kind of noise you associate with something overcrowded, uncontrolled, spilling beyond boundaries. And Enlil's response is not framed as holy wrath. It's framed as exhausted irritation. He hears the rigmu and says, basically, this has become too much. I'm losing sleep over their racket. That's the turning point. Because in the logic of the text, humanity hasn't sinned. Humanity hasn't committed a great moral crime. Humanity has exceeded capacity. The labor force has multiplied beyond the system's ability to manage it. And once you see that, the flood stops looking like divine punishment and starts looking like policy. So the gods try corrections, and the corrections read like escalating population control measures implemented, evaluated, and repeated because none of them work long term. First, plague. The gods send disease to reduce humanity. The text associates this with Namtar, the plague figure. People start dying. The population drops. But then Enki, the god associated with wisdom, and in Atrahasis, the one most sympathetic to humanity, intervenes. Enki doesn't fight Enlil openly. He doesn't start a divine civil war right there. He works around the policy. He instructs humans to concentrate their worship toward Namtar, to appease the plague force directly, and the plague fades. Humanity recovers. The gods try again. Second, drought. They withhold rain. Crops fail. Food supply collapses. Famine begins. Again, Enki intervenes not by undoing the policy directly, but by teaching humans how to survive it. He tells them to redirect worship toward Adad, the storm god. In other words, find the lever in the system, pull it the right way. The rains return. The famine ends. Humanity rebounds. Third, total resource restriction. This is where the text gets genuinely brutal. The gods cut off everything. Rain, river flooding, growth. For years, conditions worsen. Atrahasis describes an intensifying famine so severe that people descend into cannibalism. Mothers eat their children. That's not poetic symbolism. That's the text showing you what happens when a dense population exceeds food supply and the storage systems break. And yet even after that some survive. And when conditions normalize, humanity multiplies again. This is the part most people miss. The narrative isn't humans fail the test. The narrative is every corrective measure fails to restore the original equilibrium. The system cannot scale. The gods don't have a stable mechanism for managing exponential human growth. So they authorize the final reset, the flood. And again, this is the key. The flood is not framed as moral punishment. It's framed as escalation. The last resort. The thing you do when smaller interventions don't solve the problem. But Atrahasis does something even stranger than that. It admits internal disagreement. Enlil wants the reset to work completely, meaning humanity should be wiped out. Enki wants humanity preserved. So Enki violates the plan in secret. he warns Atrahasis. He gives him instructions to build a boat, not because the gods love humanity in a sentimental way, but because one faction within the system refuses total extermination. Atrahasis survives, and when the flood ends, the gods face an awkward reality. The reset failed. Not completely humanity is reduced, but the control problem is not solved permanently because the species continues. And then comes the moment that, to me, is one of the most revealing details in the entire Mesopotamian tradition. After the flood, the gods don't reassert direct governance. Instead, they negotiate. Enlil is furious that humans survived. Enki defends his choice. A compromise is reached, and the compromise is chilling in its practicality. If administrative controls fail, impose biological controls. Women will experience miscarriage and infertility. Certain classes of women will be forbidden to bear children. Death will come sooner. Limits will be built into the human condition itself. That's what Atrahasis says the post-flood world is. A world with new built-in constraints, because the previous model couldn't manage humanity through direct oversight. Now, here's why this matters beyond mythology. Because the pressures Atrahasis describes, plague, famine, water control, catastrophic flooding, aren't fantasy pressures. They're exactly what early Mesopotamian city-states actually dealt with. By the 3rd millennium BC, urban centers along the Tigris and Euphrates were growing fast. Uruk may have reached tens of thousands of people at its height, an insane concentration for that era. And that density required fragile systems, irrigation networks that had to be maintained constantly, grain storage that had to be managed precisely, labor coordination on a scale never attempted before. And those systems could collapse. Floods could destroy infrastructure overnight. Irrigation channels could silt up. Soil salinization could ruin farmland. Disease could spread through crowded neighborhoods. Harvest failures could cascade into famine. Everything depended on control. So when Atrahasis says the gods couldn't sleep because of the Rigmu, it doesn't have to mean literal sound waves bothering divine ears. It can also preserve something more grounded, elite panic about unmanageable populations, about cities becoming too large to feed, too crowded to police, too complex to govern with the old tools. And the flood, whether you see it as mythic, symbolic, historical, or some mix, matches the archaeological reality that southern Mesopotamia experienced catastrophic floods. Excavations at sites like Shuruppak, Ur, and others have revealed flood deposits from the early 3rd millennium that were severe enough to bury occupation layers and force rebuilding. Not a global deluge, but a regional catastrophe powerful enough to break continuity. And that's where the king list and Atrahasis snap together like two halves of the same record. Because the king list says, before the flood, reigns belonged to a different scale of authority. After the flood, kingship resumes but never recovers its original heavenly form. Atrahasis says, before the flood, the gods actively manage humanity, correcting, intervening, escalating. After the flood, the gods implement limits and withdraw from direct governance. So the flood becomes more than an event. It becomes the dividing line between two systems. Before, direct management. After, mediated authority, limits, distance. And that sets up the next question, maybe the hardest one so far. If the flood was the ultimate reset, and it didn't restore the old order, then what exactly changed after the waters receded? Because the post-flood world isn't just civilization continues. Civilization returns different. Kings rule, but not like before. Gods are still invoked, but not like before. And the institutions that dominate the post-flood age, the temples, the priesthood, the systems of omen reading and ritual mediation, look less like divine presence and more like divine bureaucracy. So next, we're going to follow the story into that new world, a world where kings still claim heaven, but heaven no longer shows up. After the waters, kings rule without direct divine governance. Once the flood is over, once the waters recede and the survivors crawl back into a ruined world, you'd expect the texts to tell you the gods returned in force. If this was truly a reset, if the flood was meant to restore order, then the logical next step would be simple. Re-establish direct control. Rebuild the old system. Put kingship back under immediate divine administration. But that's not what happens. Instead, what the records preserve is something quieter and, in a way, more final. The gods remain, but they move farther away. Kingship continues, but it changes shape, and the space between heaven and earth fills with institutions. The Sumerian king list itself gives us the first clue, because right after the line, "Then the flood swept over," it restarts the sequence with a phrase that sounds familiar, but doesn't land the same way. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. So at first glance, you might think, okay, kingship descends again. Heaven is still involved. But then you notice what happens immediately after. It doesn't stay. Kish holds kingship for a time. Then kingship moves. It shifts to another city, then another, then back again, like a prize being passed around through conquest and collapse. The list isn't describing a stable divine installation anymore. It's describing political volatility, and the reign lengths again tell the story in numbers. Even the first post-flood kings still reign for spans that are too long to be literal. 1,200 years, 960, 900. It's still exaggerated, but it's a fraction of what came before, and then it keeps shrinking. Century-scale reigns become shorter, long reigns become rare. Eventually you reach numbers that aren't just plausible, they're close to what we see in real dynastic sequences. So the post-flood world is still wrapped in legend at first, but it's drifting toward history. And that drift isn't just about timekeeping, it's about authority. Because what changes after the flood isn't only the length of reigns, it's the mechanism of legitimacy. Pre-flood, the language is direct. Kingship descended from heaven. Gods appoint, gods walk, gods intervene. The divine council makes decisions and humans carry them out. Post-flood, the language shifts into something more mediated. Kings don't say, "The gods rule through me." They say, "I built a temple for the god." They say, "May the god favor my reign." They say, "I acted in accordance with the will of the god." It sounds small, like a grammatical nuance, but in ancient political writing, grammar is everything. Because grammar tells you who holds agency, and after the flood, agency starts to belong to humans. Let's look at the archaeological side of this, because the dirt preserves the same transition. The earliest Sumerian cities, Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Ur, aren't just towns. They're temple complexes, massive religious centers with ziggurats dominating the skyline, surrounded by storehouses, workshops, administrative rooms, and residences for temple personnel. In the earliest layers, the temple is the state. The city is organized around religious administration. Economic life is temple life, and the tablets from these places back that up. Records of grain distributions, labor assignments, ration lists, ritual schedules managed by temple officials who operate as administrators, not just priests. This is crucial. In the earliest urban model, the divine institution isn't just spiritual, it's managerial. Temples don't merely represent gods. Temples organize labor, manage surplus, and maintain the infrastructure that keeps the city alive. Which means, if you want to imagine divine governance in a grounded way, You don't need to picture literal gods walking down streets. You can picture a system in which authority is embedded in temple administration, where the god's presence is the temple's control over food, labor, and law. But then, during the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BC, something becomes visible in the ruins. Palaces appear, not just big houses, palaces as separate power centers. Suddenly, you have two institutions standing side by side, the temple complex, the royal palace. And that's not just architecture, that's a political shift in stone, because palaces represent kingship as a human-centered authority with its own bureaucracy, its own storage, its own labor force, its own military function. In other words, you're watching kingship detach itself from temple control, and the inscriptions from this period show the same thing. Early on, rulers often frame their actions as commanded by gods. Enlil commanded me, Inanna ordered it, the god said. But as time goes on, you see more inscriptions that read like this. I, King so-and-so, built this for the god Enlil. It's still religious, still respectful, but the sentence structure flips. The king is acting, the god is receiving. The god shifts from administrator to patron, and once that shift happens, it becomes very hard for direct divine governance to return, because the human institution has learned how to run without it. This is why the post-flood world feels fundamentally different in the texts. The gods still matter, they are still invoked, they are still feared and honored, but they increasingly operate through intermediaries, through priests, through rituals, through omens, through interpretation. And this is where you start seeing the rise of what we could call the new interface between heaven and earth, the professional priesthood. Because in the post-flood world, the gods don't disappear, they become harder to access. And whenever access becomes difficult, specialists appear, people whose entire job is to interpret signs, to decode messages, to mediate the gap. In Mesopotamia, that mediation becomes an entire class structure. You have the Baru diviners who read omens, especially liver divination. You have specialists who interpret dreams. You have priests trained to read the flight patterns of birds, the shape of smoke rising from incense, the behavior of oil poured into water. And notice what this means. Divine communication is no longer direct, it's probabilistic. It's a system of signs that requires decoding. A god doesn't walk into the city and say, do this. Instead, a priest examines a sacrificed animal and says, the liver indicates the god's favor, and that difference changes the entire political dynamic. Because once divine will is mediated, it can be managed. A king can claim divine approval when it suits him. A priest can claim divine warning when it increases the priesthood's influence. And if something goes wrong, if famine hits, if war is lost, divine will can be reinterpreted after the fact. The system becomes flexible, which is exactly what an expanding civilization needs. But flexibility comes at a cost, distance. When gods speak through omens, you're no longer dealing with presence. You're dealing with interpretation. And interpretation is power. So in the post-flood world, the temple becomes more than a sacred site. It becomes an economic powerhouse. Temples control land. They oversee agriculture. They manage massive storehouses. They employ thousands of workers. They distribute rations. They run festivals that function as state events. Administrative tablets from places like Uruk and Lagash show this in detail. Barley distributions, labor assignments, temple expenditures, offerings, construction projects, payments to workers. It's not religion in the modern sense. It's governance. But now, the governance is human-run. The gods are recipients and legitimizers, not managers. And kings, especially as you move toward the era of documented empires, Lean into this model. Look at the way later kings present themselves. They don't say, "The gods rule through me like they used to." They say, "I was chosen, I was favored, I was beloved, I restored the temple, I enacted justice, I conquered enemies in the god's name." It's still divine rhetoric, but the center of action is the king. The gods become the seal on the document, not the hand that writes it. And this shift keeps intensifying. By the time you reach large imperial figures, think of the Akkadian kings, then later Babylonian rulers like Hammurabi, you see the full post-flood model mature. Humans build empires through military force and administration. Gods legitimize the empire through law, ritual, and symbolism. Hammurabi doesn't claim the gods physically govern his cities. He claims the gods gave him law to administer his conquered territories. That's the inversion. Pre-flood, gods rule, humans obey. Post-flood, humans rule, gods endorse. And when you step back, you realize the flood didn't just wipe out people. It marks the moment where the old model of governance becomes impossible to restore. Whether you read this literally, symbolically, or sociologically, the result is the same. After the flood, kingship stays on earth, and it behaves like a contested resource. It moves through conquest, it fractures, it centralizes again in empires, but it never again descends from heaven in the sense the earlier tradition implies. And that leads us to a dangerous question. Dangerous because it changes the way you read everything that comes after. Who benefited from the gods becoming distant? Because once divine presence is replaced by divine mediation, you create winners and losers. Kings gain freedom from direct oversight. Priests gain monopoly over access to the divine. And ordinary people whose voices rarely survive in the texts live under systems that can claim divine authority without providing divine accountability. So if the gods went quiet, it wasn't just a spiritual shift, it was a political one, a restructuring, a transfer of power. And if the divine realm is increasingly distant and increasingly mediated, then the myths themselves start doing something else. They begin explaining instability in the only language the culture has, divine conflict. Which brings us to the next layer of this puzzle, because in the same post-flood world where divine presence becomes rare, the stories start describing something happening above that sounds eerily similar to what's happening below. Not peace, not stable order, war, conflict, power being seized, stolen, transferred. Once you step into the post-flood world, this world of human kings, temple bureaucracies, and divine distance, you start noticing something strange in the myths. The gods don't just become distant, they become unstable. They fight, they form alliances, they overthrow each other, they steal authority, they reorganize the universe like it's a state that just went through a coup. And if you've ever wondered why so many Mesopotamian stories feel like political thrillers with cosmic costumes, this is why. Because one of the most important creation epics in the entire region, the Enuma Elish, doesn't begin with harmony. It begins with crisis. In 1849, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and recovered huge caches of clay tablets covered in Akkadian cuneiform. Among them were 7 tablets that, when assembled, formed the most complete version of the Enuma Elish ever found. The version we have is usually dated to around 1100 BC in its written form. But like many Mesopotamian texts, it almost certainly preserves older traditions that were revised and repurposed over time. And that word repurposed is everything, because the Enuma Elish isn't just theology, it's political propaganda. It was recited during the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, at the height of Babylon's cultural influence. The epic elevates Marduk, Babylon's city god, into the role of supreme cosmic ruler above older, more established gods from earlier Sumerian tradition. So, scholars are right to call it propaganda, but here's the part people tend to overlook. Even propaganda reveals what the propagandists think their audience will believe. And Babylon's propagandists chose to frame cosmic authority as contested, violent, and unstable. They didn't write a story where Marduk was always supreme and everyone happily agreed. They wrote a story where he had to win. And that choice matters because it suggests the pattern was familiar. Here's how the Enuma Elish opens. Before the world exists, there are two primordial beings. Apsu, the freshwater abyss, Tiamat, the saltwater sea. Their waters mingle and produce the first generation of gods. These younger gods are restless and loud, and the word noise shows up again in the subtext of the conflict because the young gods disturb Apsu. Apsu becomes irritated, and his solution is extreme. Destroy them. Tiamat initially resists. She's not eager to wipe out her own offspring, but as the conflict escalates, she's pulled into it. The younger gods discover the plot, and Ea, also known as Enki in older traditions, acts first. He kills Apsu. Tiamat, enraged by Apsu's death, prepares for war. She doesn't just raise an army, she manufactures terror. The text lists monsters, serpents, dragons, hybrid demon creatures, forces designed to overwhelm the younger gods. Then she appoints a commander, Kingu, her new consort, and she gives Kingu the most important political object in the entire epic, the Tablet of Destinies. This tablet isn't a metaphor in the way modern readers assume. In Mesopotamian thought, it's the physical instrument of authority. Whoever holds it has the right to decide outcomes, to decree order, to command the structure of reality. So now you have a cosmic political crisis. The gods panic. None of the younger gods want to face Tiamat and her army until Marduk steps forward. But Marduk doesn't volunteer out of pure heroism. He makes a demand. He will fight only if the gods make him their permanent king afterward. They agree. Marduk defeats Tiamat. He splits her body in half and uses it to form the heavens and the earth. He seizes the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu. Then he reorganizes the cosmos, assigns roles, and establishes Babylon, his own city, as the center of divine order. The epic ends with the gods proclaiming Marduk's 50 names, each one an aspect of his supremacy. And if you've studied Mesopotamian religion even a little, you can see what's happening. This isn't just a creation story, it's an empire story. It's the cosmic version of what Babylon wanted politically. Order exists because our God won. Now, mainstream scholarship reads this as straightforward. The gods in the story mirror human politics. As Babylon rises, Marduk rises. That's true. But it raises a deeper question. If the Enuma Elish is propaganda, why does it admit instability at the foundation? Why not write a smoother story? Why preserve the idea that authority is something that can be stolen, contested, transferred? Because the audience would recognize it. Mesopotamian history, real history, is a cycle of rise and fall. Kish dominates, then Uruk, then Ur, then Akkad, then fragmentation, then Babylon, then Assyria, then Babylon again. Constant regime changes, constant legitimization crises. And every new regime needs the same thing. Not just power, justification. You can win a war and take a city, but you still need the people to accept that your rule is valid, that your kingship is meant to be, that it sits inside a cosmic order rather than being pure violence. So you rewrite the cosmos. You reshuffle the divine hierarchy. When Babylon dominates, Marduk becomes supreme. When Assyria dominates, Ashur rises. When different cities control trade routes, temple theologies shift, emphasis shifts, which gods receive, which festivals shifts. In a world where politics is unstable, theology becomes a tool to stabilize it by explaining instability itself as cosmic. But here's where things get more unsettling. The divine conflict narratives don't just mirror human conflict, they also preserve a repeated motif. Authority is embodied in physical objects, and those objects can be stolen. The Tablet of Destinies in the Enuma Elish is one example. There's another famous story, Anzu. In the Epic of Anzu, a bird-like figure steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil, triggering chaos. The gods scramble to recover it. Eventually it's taken back and order is restored. And in Sumerian tradition, there's a related concept, the me. The me are decrees or principles, powerful rules of civilization. And in the myths, they can be possessed, transferred, bargained over, or taken. Again, this isn't abstract philosophy. It reads like a political reality encoded in myth. Because real kingship in Mesopotamia depended on physical symbols of authority, crowns, scepters, standards, seals, inscribed tablets, captured enemy idols. When a king conquered a rival city, he didn't just occupy it. He often seized the city's divine statue and carried it away. The god itself, represented physically, became a spoil of war. And when you do that, you aren't just humiliating your enemy, you're transferring legitimacy. So when the myths describe gods stealing cosmic authority tablets, it matches how human empires stole divine images and symbols on the ground. Heaven and earth aren't separate in these traditions. They are reflections. And that means the divine wars aren't just random stories. They are explanations. Explanations for why order is never permanent, for why kingship doesn't stay in one place, for why authority can move, collapse, reorganize. But there's another detail that makes this even more interesting. The divine conflicts aren't cyclical in the same war again sense. They're progressive. Each conflict ends with reorganization. The structure changes. The hierarchy tightens. In the oldest Sumerian worldview, you often see the gods as a council, deliberating, negotiating, balancing forces. In later Babylonian worldview, you see a supreme god Marduk holding centralized authority and delegating roles. The divine world becomes more hierarchical over time, and that tracks human political evolution almost perfectly. As city-states become empires, divine councils become divine monarchies. As human kingship becomes absolute, divine kingship becomes absolute. As military power becomes the foundation of rule, cosmic warfare becomes the foundation of creation. Now here's the uncomfortable pivot. Mainstream scholarship says humans projected their politics onto the gods, but you could also flip it the other way. What if these stories preserve memory of a governance system experiencing factional conflict? Not necessarily literal gods in the supernatural sense, but an upper order, a ruling structure, an elite system, something that fractured, because the texts themselves describe the divine realm as divided, competitive, unstable, subject to coups, reorganized after violence. And if you're tracking the larger question we started with, why did divine governance fade? Then divine war narratives become a possible missing piece, because collapse doesn't always come from below. Sometimes it comes from inside. If the older model of authority, the one remembered as kingship descended from heaven, began to fracture internally, then withdrawal would make sense, distance would make sense, mediation would make sense, and suddenly the post-flood world of priests and omens looks less like the gods are gone, and more like the gods can't maintain direct control anymore. So, whether you interpret divine wars as pure allegory for human politics, a tool for imperial propaganda, or memory of real factional conflict inside an older authority system. The same pattern remains. Authority at the top is contested. Order is not automatic, and whatever stability once existed is replaced by struggle, seizure, and reorganization. Which brings us to the next layer. Because there's a specific kind of story that appears again and again across Mesopotamian tradition and across other cultures too. Stories about humans crossing the boundary between earth and heaven, entering the divine council, receiving knowledge, coming back, and then the boundary closes permanently. If there's one thing the Mesopotamian texts repeat, sometimes directly, sometimes through implication, it's that there used to be a bridge between humans and the divine realm. Not just prayer, not just ritual, not just maybe the gods heard you. A bridge you could cross. The gods could descend. Humans, at least certain humans, could ascend. And then, at some point, that bridge shuts down. The gate closes, and it never opens again. This is where the Epic of Gilgamesh becomes more than a story about mortality. It becomes a kind of boundary marker, like a warning sign planted at the edge of a world humans no longer have access to. In 1853, Hormuzd-Rassam discovered a set of tablets in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. When scholars assembled and translated them, they produced the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh ever found a story copied and refined across Mesopotamia for nearly 2,000 years. Gilgamesh is introduced with a detail that's so specific, it almost feels like it's daring you to ignore it. He is 2/3 god, 1/3 man, not half divine, like later hero traditions you might recognize. 2/3, a ratio, a number. The text repeats it as if the precision matters, and maybe it does, because Gilgamesh is consistently presented as belonging to the last era, where kings could plausibly claim some kind of direct connection to the older order. After him, that connection thins, kingship becomes fully human, and the epic tells you why. At first, Gilgamesh is not a noble hero. He's powerful and restless, and he abuses his power. The people of Uruk cry out. The gods respond not by directly governing, but by creating a counterweight, Enkidu, a wild man raised among animals, meant to challenge Gilgamesh. They fight, then become companions, and together they do what semi-divine figures do in myth. They cross boundaries. They travel to forbidden places. They kill beings meant to guard the world's edges. They challenge divine property. They kill Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest. They slay the bull of heaven, sent by Ishtar. And then the story makes its most important move. Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh, 2/3 god, faces the one thing his ratio can't protect him from, mortality. The second half of the epic shifts tone entirely. It stops being about adventure and becomes about panic, grief, a king staring at the inevitability that all rulers eventually face. Gilgamesh goes looking for immortality, not in a symbolic way, either. He goes looking for a person who supposedly has it, Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the man who lived through the deluge and was granted eternal life afterward. Gilgamesh crosses deserts, mountains of darkness, and the waters of death obstacles framed as lethal to normal humans. This is the epic showing you the last attempt to breach the barrier. And when Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, he asks the question that defines the entire post-flood world. How did you get eternal life? Utnapishtim's answer is devastating, and it's delivered like a verdict. You can't. His immortality was an exception granted because he survived the flood, because he was part of a moment the gods swore would never happen again. There is no path, no ritual, no secret method, no update. The age when humans could become more than human is over, but the epic doesn't stop there. It gives Gilgamesh one final thread to pull, one last chance to prove the boundary is still permeable. Utnapishtim tells him about a plant at the bottom of the sea, one that restores youth. Gilgamesh retrieves it. For a moment, he holds rejuvenation in his hands. He has proof that something beyond normal human limits is still accessible. Then it's stolen. A serpent takes the plant while Gilgamesh bathes. The serpent sheds its skin and escapes renewed, and Gilgamesh returns empty-handed. This is not a random plot twist. It's a statement. The epic is telling you, renewal is no longer for you. The world still contains the mechanism, but it belongs elsewhere now. And the ending drives it home. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and points to the walls, not to heaven, not to divine secrets, to stone, to architecture, to human-made permanence. The message is brutal in its simplicity. If you can't live forever, build something that outlives you. Immortality becomes memory. Legacy, the post-flood substitute. Now, on its own, you could read this as a philosophical story about accepting death, but the larger tradition around it makes the pattern far stranger, because Gilgamesh isn't the only figure described as crossing the boundary between earth and heaven. There's an older tradition that does something even more explicit. A figure named Enmeduranki. Enmeduranki appears in the Sumerian king list as the 7th antediluvian king of Sipar, ruling for an impossibly long span. But he also appears elsewhere in a separate Babylonian tradition that describes him not primarily as a ruler, but as the founder of a priestly lineage. And this tradition says something extraordinary. It says the gods Shamash and Adad brought Enmeduranki into heaven, not metaphorically. They brought him in. They showed him the secrets of divination, how to interpret oil on water, how to read the liver of sacrificed animals, how to decode the signs the gods leave in the world. They gave him the tablet of the gods. They admitted him into the divine council, and then they sent him back to earth to establish the Baru priesthood and pass this knowledge down. This is one of the clearest examples of what we could call authorized access. A human is granted entry, receives instruction, returns, and then the tradition stops. No later king is described ascending like that. No post-flood ruler is invited into heaven to receive training. And if you've ever read comparative myth, you might already feel something tightening here, because there's a parallel that's almost impossible to ignore. The biblical tradition of Enoch. Enoch is the 7th figure in a pre-flood genealogy. He walks with God, and then he's taken. He enters the heavenly realm. He is shown cosmic secrets, calendars, structures of the universe, the mechanics of judgment. He returns, at least in some traditions, to pass knowledge on, and then he ascends permanently. 7th in the sequence, pre-flood, ascends to heaven, receives secret knowledge, returns to instruct, and then access closes. The parallels between Enmeduranki and Enoch are so tight that scholars have debated influence for decades. Did the Enoch tradition derive from Mesopotamian material, or do both preserve an older motif shared across cultures? But the direction of influence isn't even the most important part. The motif itself is, because it tells you what these cultures believed about the timeline of divine human contact. There was an earlier age when the boundary was open. Certain individuals, especially those positioned as foundational, could cross it. They could receive knowledge from above. And after the flood, that access is revoked. The gate closes. The interface changes from direct contact to mediated signs. Now, once you notice this, it starts showing up everywhere. In Egypt, early pharaohs are described as literal gods walking in human form. Later pharaohs become divinely appointed. Later still, divinely favored mortals. Distance increases. In Greece, the age of heroes figures born from divine human unions gives way to fully mortal eras. The gods become more remote, less present, less willing to show up directly. And across traditions, the same thing happens. The earlier world is described as more porous. The later world is described as sealed. So what does the Gilgamesh epic accomplish in that larger pattern? It takes the last semi-divine king and tests the boundary. Gilgamesh is the best candidate for crossing back over. If anyone should still have access, it's him, and yet he fails not because he's weak, but because the rules have changed. Utnapishtim tells him directly, the exception will not repeat. The plant is stolen. The story ends grounded in walls. And in doing so, the epic functions like a cultural closure statement. The old world is over. Immortality is not on the table anymore. Heaven is closed. Now, here's the question that naturally follows, and it's one of the hardest questions in the entire narrative. If these are purely symbolic stories meant to teach acceptance of human limits, why frame immortality as something that was once attainable? Why not say it never existed at all? If Enmeduranki is just a legend about the origins of divination, why describe the techniques as brought from heaven rather than discovered by humans through trial and error? The texts insist the boundary used to be open. They name individuals who crossed it. They describe what was learned on the other side. And then they emphasize again and again that the crossing is no longer permitted, which leaves two broad interpretations. 1. These are coordinated cultural narratives designed to explain why humans feel separated from the divine stories that justify religious mediation and priesthood authority. 2. These are fragmented memories, mythologized, stylized, but preserving the outline of a real transition where some form of direct authority, access, or governance was withdrawn and replaced by institutions. And now we're back to the central question, sharper than ever. If the withdrawal happened, whether literal or sociological, why? What forces an authority system to shut the gate? What makes the old model impossible to maintain? Next, we're going to step into the part of the conversation where the script stops describing the mystery and starts evaluating explanations without jumping to extremes. 3 grounded frameworks. 3 different ways to interpret the 4, and what each one can and cannot explain. At this point in the story, we've built up a pattern that's hard to ignore. Early texts describe kingship as something that descends from heaven, and rulers who reign on a scale that doesn't fit human life at all. They describe gods who intervene directly, manage outcomes, appoint rulers, and sometimes even walk through cities like they belong there. Later texts still talk about gods, but they're different. They're distant, mediated, communicating through signs, omens, priests, rituals. Kings still claim divine favor, but the divine presence fades into the background, and the dividing line textually, chronologically, conceptually is the flood. So what do we do with that? This is where a lot of conversations crash into the same wall. People either dismiss everything as myth, or they jump straight to the most sensational explanation imaginable. But there's a better way to approach it. Instead of asking, which interpretation is the coolest, we ask, which interpretations can actually account for the pattern in the evidence? Because the evidence isn't one text. It's a network. King lists, flood narratives, creation epics, temple archives, inscriptions, iconography. None of them alone proves anything dramatic, but together they preserve the same direction of change. So here are 3 broad frameworks, 3 ways people interpret the Anunnaki and the collapse of direct divine governance, not to crown one as true, but to see what each one explains well and where each one struggles. Interpretation A. The Anunnaki as mythic language for authority. This is the mainstream academic approach. In this view, the Anunnaki are not beings in a literal sense. They're a cultural way of talking about cosmic order political legitimacy, hierarchy, and the structure of society. Kingship descended from heaven becomes a formula, a claim that authority is sanctioned by the sacred, not invented by people. The Anunnaki decided becomes a way of saying the established order determined. Divine councils become political councils, projected upward into myth, and this framework has real strengths. It explains why the texts are politically useful. It explains why different city-states shape versions of the king list to legitimize their own dynasties. It explains why theology shifts alongside politics, why Marduk rises with Babylon, why Ashur rises with Assyria. It explains why divine wars mirror human wars, because myth is the language ancient states use to make violence feel justified. It also helps explain why the reign lengths shrink. As records become more historical and less ideological, the cosmic time scheme gives way to time that matches lived reality. But this interpretation runs into a tension that never fully goes away. The scribes don't write like they're telling symbolic stories. They write like they're documenting facts. They don't mark a boundary between legend and history. They present one continuous sequence. So, if the Anunnaki were always symbolic, why maintain the fiction with such consistency, especially in bureaucratic formats that otherwise deal with real administration? Why preserve an opening line like "Kingship descended from heaven" for centuries, even when the political reality is obviously human kings waging human wars? In other words, the mainstream view explains the function of the mythology, but it doesn't fully explain the tone. And tone is what keeps pulling people back into the question. Interpretation B. The Anunnaki as remembered elites or ruling strata. This framework takes the texts more literally, but not supernaturally. It suggests that the Anunnaki may preserve distorted memory of real rulers, an elite class, priest kings, or an early dominating group who established the first centralized systems in Mesopotamia. Over time, that elite becomes mythologized into gods. This isn't far-fetched as a historical process. We've seen it happen repeatedly. A powerful leader becomes legendary. Legend becomes ritual. Ritual becomes theology. And centuries later, the original human figure is remembered as divine. So, under this view, the antediluvian kings, those impossibly long reigns, could be a stylized way of describing early dynastic eras or ruling houses rather than literal lifespans. The flood becomes a real catastrophe, environmental, political, or both, that destroys the old, centralized structure. When civilization rebuilds, new rulers inherit the territory, but not the original legitimacy. So they anchor themselves in a mythologized past. We are heirs of the ones who ruled when kingship came from heaven. This framework does a strong job with the political feel of the texts. It fits the way the king list functions as a legitimacy tool. It fits the way Atrahasis reads like elite anxiety about managing populations. It fits the gradual shift from temple-centered cities to palace-centered kingdoms. It fits why direct divine governance fades, because the remembered ruling class collapses, fragments, or is replaced. But this framework has its own problem: timing. Early dynastic Mesopotamia is not that far removed from the periods these traditions describe. If the Anunnaki were just early human elites, how fast did they become gods in cultural memory? How quickly does a ruling class become supernatural? It happens over centuries, yes, but in Mesopotamia, the written tradition is ancient and relatively continuous. The texts preserve early material and copy it forward. The gap isn't always large enough to make total deification feel simple. So interpretation B explains the human political side well, but struggles with how quickly and how completely the language becomes divine. Interpretation C. The Anunnaki as non-human overseers. This is the one that gets tied to ancient astronaut narratives, especially after Zecharia Sitchin popularized it in the 1970 seconds. To be clear, mainstream scholarship rejects Sitchin's translations and conclusions for good reasons. His linguistic claims often don't hold up. His astronomical model doesn't match Mesopotamian cosmology, and a lot of the argument relies on stretching terms beyond their usage. But here's the thing. Sitchin didn't invent the question. He just gave it the most dramatic answer possible. And the reason this interpretation persists isn't because the evidence proves aliens. It's because the texts themselves often sound concrete. The king list reads like a ledger. Atrahasis reads like policy escalation. Stories about ascension to heaven read like access to a higher authority realm. So, proponents of Interpretation C argue these are distorted records of contact with non-human entities, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or otherwise, who governed early humanity and then withdrew. And it's important to say what this view explains well and what it doesn't. It explains why the early reigns are impossible if read as human lifespans. It explains why kingship descends from heaven as literal arrival of authority. It explains why the flood is framed as management. It explains why access closes because the overseers withdraw. But it fails on the most critical standard of historical methodology. There is no physical evidence supporting extraterrestrial contact in ancient Mesopotamia. No artifacts that require non-human technology to explain. No verified material trace that forces the conclusion. And most of the detailed proofs in popular culture rely on mistranslations or cherry-picked lines removed from context. So, Interpretation C persists less as scholarship and more as a response to an emotional gap. People feel the tone of the documents doesn't match the "it's just symbolic" explanation, so they reach for something that matches the concreteness. And this is where the conversation becomes really interesting, not about aliens, but about psychology. Because the reason alternative interpretations thrive is often simple. The mainstream explanation can feel incomplete. If the scribes wrote like accountants, people want the content to behave like an account. When official frameworks say, it's metaphor, but the text reads like administration, the mismatch creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled, sometimes with careful interpretation, sometimes with the most sensational story available. So where does that leave us? If we're being honest, the evidence allows multiple interpretations, and none of them is perfect. Interpretation A explains function and political use, but struggles with tone and continuity. Interpretation B explains the political collapse feel, but struggles with the speed of mythologization. Interpretation C explains the concreteness, but lacks material evidence and relies heavily on speculative leaps. So instead of trying to solve the Anunnaki, there's a better question. Regardless of what the Anunnaki were, symbolic constructs, mythologized elites, or something else, what did humans do that made the old order impossible to maintain? Because every framework agrees on one fact: something changed permanently. Early texts assume centralized authority comes from above. Later texts assume authority is human and contested, legitimized by reference to above. Early narratives assume direct governance. Later narratives assume distance and mediation. So, whether the collapse was ideological, political, environmental, or something we can't fully name, the outcome is the same. Humanity emerges autonomous, self-governing, no longer managed from above. And that sets up the final move of this story, the end point we can actually document without needing to prove anything supernatural. How, across centuries, the gods become memory, how divine presence becomes ritual, how authority becomes something humans justify rather than receive, and how a late Babylonian king ends up doing what we would recognize today as archaeology, searching for foundations the gods no longer reveal. So here we are. We've followed the arc from the top of the king list, where reigns stretch into impossible spans, down through the flood line that splits the timeline into a post-flood world where kingship becomes contested, human-centered, and increasingly bureaucratic. We've watched the divine presence fade into mediation. We've watched the bridge between heaven and earth close. We've watched the gods transform from rulers into legitimizers, then into symbols, and finally into memory. And the most unsettling part is that the texts don't describe this as a clean evolution. They describe it like a wound, like something broke, like something ended and never returned. That's why this question keeps coming back. Not because we can prove the Anunnaki were this or that, but because the pattern is consistent across the sources. Before, immediate authority. After, mediated authority. Before, kingship descends. After, kingship is seized. Before, humans sometimes cross into the divine realm. After, the gate is shut. The post-flood world is recognizable to us. Its politics, power, competition, propaganda, institutions, specialists, bureaucracy, its kings fighting kings, empires rising and collapsing, its human history. And in that sense, you could argue, yes, this is progress. Humans step out of direct oversight. Humans become autonomous. Humans govern themselves. But if you read the Mesopotamian record on its own terms, the emotional framing is different, because to the scribes, the post-flood world is not framed as triumphant. It's framed as smaller, shorter, less luminous. It's a world where kings don't reign for thousands of years. It's a world where immortality is off the table. It's a world where divine contact is filtered through signs and professionals. It's a world where the best a king can do is build walls and hope his name outlives him. So the question becomes sharp and uncomfortable. Was the silence of the gods liberation or exile? Because depending on how you interpret the earlier divine governance, the answer changes. If the Anunnaki are just mythic language for authority, then what collapses isn't literal gods, it's a worldview, an old model of legitimacy. In that case, exile is psychological, the feeling of separation from a sacred order that once seemed immediate. If the Anunnaki preserve memory of elite rule, a priestly or ruling class mythologized into divinity, then exile is political, a rupture where the old centralized system collapses and humans inherit a more violent, competitive world. And if you entertain, even cautiously, the idea that the texts preserve a memory of literal overseers, then exile is structural. The management system withdraws, leaving humanity to run a world it didn't design. But here's what's fascinating. No matter which framework you pick, the emotional outcome is the same. The texts are haunted by a sense of loss. They don't celebrate the gods going quiet. They explain it. They justify it. They ritualize it. But they don't cheer it. And that sense of loss is most visible in what replaces presence, ritual. Because in a world where gods no longer show up directly, ritual becomes the closest thing to contact. And ritual has a specific psychological function. It keeps the relationship alive even when the other side is silent. That's why the later Mesopotamian world becomes so heavily ritualized, so heavily mediated, so obsessed with omens, divination, purity, offerings, calendrical precision, not because the gods are more present, but because they're less. When direct access disappears, people build systems to simulate it. That's not unique to Mesopotamia, by the way. You see it across cultures. When the divine feels distant, mediation grows. Priesthoods become more specialized. Ritual becomes more complex. Interpretation becomes power. And the need for legitimacy becomes relentless. Because once authority is no longer delivered, it has to be defended. And that's the part modern audiences connect to without even realizing it. We live in a world where authority is contested, where power claims legitimacy through narratives, where institutions mediate meaning, where people argue over what higher principles actually demand, because the principles don't speak for themselves. In that sense, the post-flood world is our world, and the ancient record reads like the moment that world begins, which is why the Sumerian king list is so unsettling. Not because it proves supernatural kings, but because it preserves, in a bureaucratic tone, the idea that there was a before where governance operated under different rules, and it preserves the flood as the moment those rules end. And you might be thinking, okay, but what do we do with the absurd numbers? The 28,800-year reigns, the 241,200-year total. We do what the scribes did. We treat them as meaningful, not necessarily literal, but meaningful, because whether those numbers represent cosmic cycles, ideological eras, dynastic blocks, or something older and stranger, they serve the same function. They place the origin of kingship outside human invention. They say, this didn't start with us. It came from above. And then the rest of the record is essentially the story of what happens when above goes quiet, when you're cut off, when the system that once anchored legitimacy can no longer be accessed directly. Now here's where we need to be careful, because it's easy to slip into romanticizing the past. A lot of modern people hear the gods walked among us and imagine a golden age, but the texts don't describe a paradise. Atrahasis describes a labor system so brutal the gods themselves revolt. Humans are created to do drudgery. Population control measures are attempted. Plagues, droughts, famine, catastrophic reset. That doesn't sound like a gentle utopia. It sounds like governance under stress. So exile might not mean being cast out of a perfect world. It might mean something else. Being released from direct management, violent, controlling management, and forced into autonomy. In that sense, the flood becomes not just catastrophe, but transition, a forced break, a severing, a point of no return, and the post-flood world is what grows from that severing. Messy, human, competitive, fragile, but free enough to evolve beyond direct oversight. That brings us to the last question that matters. Not were the Anunnaki aliens? Not did Alulim literally reign 28,800 years? The question the evidence keeps whispering is simpler. Why does the ancient record preserve the same transition so consistently? Why do multiple independent traditions keep telling the same shape of story? A world where the divine is close. A crisis where humanity becomes unmanageable. A flood that resets but doesn't restore. A new world where kings rule without direct divine presence. A closing of heaven. A turn from presence to memory. And here's what I think is the most honest way to conclude. We may never prove what the Anunnaki were, but we can still understand what the texts are doing. They are documenting through mythic language and bureaucratic structure humanity's shift into self-governance. They preserve the trauma of that shift. They preserve the anxiety of living without direct oversight. They preserve the need to justify authority when authority is no longer delivered. And they preserve the oldest question that still lives in every civilization. Who gave us the right to rule? Because once the gods stop walking among kings, that question doesn't disappear. It just becomes ours to answer. And maybe that's the real reason these texts still feel alive. Because even now, thousands of years later, modern societies still wrestle with legitimacy, power, and the feeling that something higher used to be clearer. So whether the silence was progress or exile, one thing is undeniable. After the flood, the world belonged entirely to humans, and humans had to learn slowly, violently, imperfectly how to govern a world without heaven stepping in. Which means the silence of the gods isn't just an ancient mystery. It's the beginning of history as we recognize it. And if you think about it that way, the most disturbing part of the Sumerian king list isn't that it begins with impossible reigns. It's that it ends in something we still haven't outgrown. Authority without certainty. Power without presence. A world where the heavens are closed and the responsibility is all ours. And this is where the story turns back on itself, because once you reach that conclusion, the heavens are closed and the responsibility is ours, you start realizing something else. The ancient writers weren't just recording a past, they were explaining their present. They were living in a world where the gods were still official, still honored, still central to legitimacy, but no longer felt close in the way older stories assumed. And that gap, that distance, is exactly where religion, politics, and memory start doing their most intense work. Because when direct contact disappears, you don't stop believing. You compensate, you build structures around absence. And Mesopotamia is basically the first civilization that shows us that compensation in high resolution through tablets, lists, archives, rituals, and propaganda. Think about how strange the king list really is when you zoom out. It's not a myth told around a fire. It's not a poem meant to entertain. It's a legitimacy document, a tool used by states, copied, edited, maintained, and yet it begins with something no state should want to begin with if it's only selling its own authority, a category of rulers that don't fit human reality. If you're a king in the 2nd millennium BC trying to prove your dynasty is legitimate, why start your chain with 8 kings whose reigns are so vast they break believability? Why not start with the earliest remembered human kings? Why anchor your claim in something that invites doubt? Unless the point isn't believability in our sense, unless the point is to anchor kingship itself outside human choice, to say, this isn't just politics, this is the structure of the world, this is how it was installed, and the installation came from above. That's why the opening phrase matters so much. After the kingship descended from heaven, it doesn't just describe authority, it defines it. Authority is not invented, authority is received. That worldview is the foundation of early centralized power. If your population is growing, your city is expanding, your irrigation network requires constant coordination, then you need something stronger than, I'm the toughest guy with the biggest army. You need cosmic inevitability. You need inevitability to feel like nature. So, kingship descends from heaven. The problem is, as history progresses, kingship looks less and less like something descended and more like something seized. Cities fight, dynasties overthrow, empires absorb rival gods, and rewrite the cosmic story to make it all feel ordained. And that's where the divine war narratives start doing their job. They normalize instability. They say, yes, authority changes hands, because even in heaven, authority changes hands. They say, yes, the tablet of destinies can be stolen, because even cosmic order depends on possession, power, and enforcement. They don't resolve the instability, they justify it. And then you get something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which does something even more psychologically intense. It takes the last semi-divine king, 2/3 god, 1/3 man, and it forces him to fail at the one thing that would prove the bridge is still open. Gilgamesh reaches Utnapishtim and learns the oldest brutal lesson of the post-flood world. You don't get to cross anymore. The exception has been sealed. Immortality is a relic. Heaven is closed. And the epic doesn't end with divine consolation. It ends with walls. Stone, human permanence in a world where cosmic permanence is gone. So, the question becomes, what are these texts really remembering? Not in the "are they literally true" sense, but in the deeper sense, the sense that matters for how cultures encode trauma. Because cultures don't preserve stories for thousands of years just because they're entertaining. They preserve the stories that solve problems, stories that explain why the world is the way it is, stories that justify structures of power, stories that process catastrophe. And the flood, whatever it was historically, functions in the texts as the dividing line between two kinds of reality. Before, divine management, direct involvement, permeability between realms. After, human management, indirect signs, closed gates. That's not just mythology fading into history. It's an institutional shift, a transfer of power. And once you frame it that way, you start seeing the post-flood world as the birthplace of something we still live inside, the era of mediated truth. Because in the pre-flood imagination, the gods are present enough that authority can be confirmed. In the post-flood reality, authority has to be interpreted, and interpretation creates a whole ecosystem. Priests, diviners, scribes, omens, rituals, purity systems, temples as economic hubs, kings using divine favor as a stamp. It's a world where the gods are still real enough to matter, but distant enough to require specialists, and specialists become power centers. That's how you get a civilization where liver divination can guide military campaigns, where a dream can become policy, where an eclipse is read like a warning letter from the sky. Not because the sky is literally writing, but because people need a way to interact with a higher order when the higher order doesn't speak plainly. This is why the story of Unmanageable matters so much, because it preserves a memory of a moment when divine knowledge was directly taught to a human, when the techniques of mediation weren't invented on Earth, but granted from above. Whether that's literal or symbolic, the effect is the same. It sanctifies the priesthood. It says, we didn't make this up. We inherited it. We were trained. And once the gate closes, that inheritance becomes untouchable. No updates. No direct confirmation. Just tradition. Just procedure. Just interpretation. Now, at this point, you might be tempted to ask the most obvious question. So did something actually happen around the early 3rd millennium BC that could have produced a flood line in cultural memory? And the honest answer is, the region absolutely did experience catastrophic flooding and disruption. Southern Mesopotamia is built on unstable rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates are unpredictable. Cities were constructed on floodplains, and the archaeological record does preserve flood deposits that correspond to major destructive events. But here's what matters more than the geology: the way the flood is used. Because the flood becomes the boundary marker not just for destroyed cities, but for ended access. It's the moment the old model of authority stops functioning. So whether the flood was a real environmental catastrophe, a metaphor for political collapse, or some fusion of both, its cultural role is consistent. It explains why the gods don't rule like they used to. And when you compare that to later kings like Nabonidus searching for ancient foundations the gods won't reveal, you get a full arc. Early. Heaven is an active source of authority. Late. Heaven is a silent reference point. Early. Kingship is delivered. Late. Kingship is justified. Early. Divine presence is assumed. Late. Divine absence is managed. And that management is what creates civilization in the form we recognize. So now we come to the edge of the final question again, only this time it's sharper. If the gods went silent because the system couldn't scale, because humans multiplied, expanded, and became unmanageable, then what exactly does that mean? Did humanity evolve beyond needing direct oversight? Or did humanity become a risk that oversight could no longer contain? Because Atrahasis doesn't say the gods left because humans were enlightened. It says they left because humans were too loud, too many, too difficult to control, which means the silence at the top of history can be read two ways: liberation or containment. And that's where the final chapters go, because once you see the pattern clearly, the question stops being, what do you believe? It becomes, what kind of world do these texts describe humanity entering? A world that belongs to us, or a world we were pushed into? And in the last stretch, we're going to tie the threads together: the king list, the flood epics, the closing of heaven, the rise of mediation, and land on the only honest conclusion the evidence allows. We don't know exactly what the gods were, but we can see exactly what the silence did. So let's tie the threads together, because if you've stayed with me this far, you can probably feel the shape of the answer, even if we can't pin down the identity of the Anunnaki like a label on a museum shelf. The king list gives us the timeline structure. Atrahasis gives us the logic of the crisis. The divine war narratives show us instability above, mirroring instability below. Gilgamesh and Enmaduranki show us the boundary closing heaven, becoming inaccessible. And the late kings like Nabonidus show us the end state. Gods as memory, not presence. That's the arc. But the important part isn't just the arc. It's what that arc does to human society. Because once heaven closes, whether literally in belief or structurally in governance, everything downstream changes. And you can watch that change happen in the most grounded material evidence we have: institutions. Early Mesopotamia is temple-centered. The temple is the warehouse, the employer, the ration distributor, the manager of labor. It's where power lives. In that world, the god is not only a theological figure, it's the center of administration. But as cities grow, the palace appears. As warfare intensifies, kings need standing forces. As trade expands, you need records, contracts, seals, laws. And the temple remains powerful, but it becomes one pillar among others. So in the post-flood world, authority becomes plural. Kings command armies. Priests interpret the gods. Scribes run the paperwork that makes both systems function. Cities compete. Dynasties rise and fall. That's what human-centered governance looks like. Complexity. And complexity creates a new need that the pre-flood worldview didn't require in the same way. Constant legitimation. Because when kingship is no longer a visible descent, it must be justified repeatedly. That's why king lists keep being copied. That's why inscriptions keep invoking divine favor. That's why temples keep expanding. That's why omens become a political technology. Because when authority is contested, people don't just fight over land and grain, they fight over meaning. They fight over who the gods favor. They fight over what the will of heaven actually is. And this is why divine distance is not a small theological change. It's a power rearrangement. When gods are close, authority can be verified. A god can punish a king. A god can overturn a policy. A god can enforce a decree. When gods are distant, enforcement shifts downward, and that means the people who control interpretation, priests, scribes, diviners, gain leverage. The whole system begins to run on mediation. And here's where we can draw an uncomfortable but very modern parallel. A world governed by mediated signs is a world where truth is always argued, where legitimacy is always negotiated, where authority becomes something you persuade people to accept. And that world is fragile, because once you remove direct oversight, whether divine or symbolic, everything depends on human systems staying stable. But human systems don't stay stable. They fracture. They corrupt. They get captured by elites. They turn violent. And that's exactly what you see in Mesopotamian history. The centuries after the early dynastic period are not peaceful. They are an almost continuous sequence of competition and consolidation. City-states fight for control of canals and trade. Empires form, collapse, and reform. New dynasties rewrite the past to justify the present. The gods are reorganized to match political realities. And all of it, every bit of it, happens under the shadow of a remembered earlier age when order was supposedly more stable, more direct, more heavenly. That remembered earlier age becomes a standard no one can reach again, which might be the most important psychological function of the antediluvian section of the King List. It doesn't just begin the timeline. It establishes a lost magnitude, a scale that makes everything after feel diminished. Even if you read the numbers symbolically, the message is the same. There was once a kind of kingship beyond what we have now, and we are living in the aftermath. Now, in modern terms, you could say, that's just nostalgia. Every civilization imagines a golden age. But Mesopotamia doesn't frame it as golden. It frames it as managed, and management is the key. Atrahasis doesn't describe humans longing for gods, because gods are morally perfect. It describes gods as administrators trying to control population. It describes policies, escalations, resets. So if the old system was managed, then the post-flood world is unmanaged, or, more precisely, self-managed. And self-management is both freedom and burden. This brings us back to that two-way reading we touched earlier. Was the silence liberation or containment? Because there's a subtle but chilling possibility embedded in the Atrahasis logic. If the gods withdrew because humans were too numerous, too loud, too difficult to govern, then the withdrawal is not a reward. It's a response. It's damage control. It's what happens when a management system can't handle the scale of the workforce anymore. And in that case, the closing of heaven starts looking less like humans matured and more like contact was restricted. Not because humans were too sinful, but because humans became too complex, too unpredictable, too hard to manage through direct intervention. Now, I want to be careful here, because we don't need to prove literal overseers to see the mechanism. Even within interpretation, a purely symbolic authority, the story still functions as a cultural explanation for why rule is hard, why legitimacy is fragile, why leaders can't just claim heaven and expect stability. Because the post-flood world is a world where kings can't rely on divine presence to keep people in line. They need laws, armies, bureaucracy, and narratives strong enough to hold society together. And that's why Mesopotamian civilization becomes so obsessed with writing. Not just because writing is useful, because writing becomes the substitute for presence. A written law code stands in for divine decree. A written king list stands in for heavenly descent. A written omen manual stands in for direct instruction. A written ritual calendar stands in for a god showing up and saying, do it like this. The more distant the gods become, the more ink and clay expand to fill the gap. So when we look at Mesopotamia and see the birth of documentation, contracts, receipts, laws, epics, lists, we're not just seeing administration, we're seeing a civilization building scaffolding around absence. Which is why, by the time you reach Nabonidus, the king is doing something that would feel completely out of place in the earliest descended kingship worldview. He is searching the ground. He is consulting old records. He is trying to rebuild legitimacy through archaeology. That's what happens when gods become memory. People start looking backward. They start trying to recover foundations, because the present no longer contains the same kind of certainty. And that brings us to the last move. If the ancient texts preserve a shift from presence to memory, and if that shift is framed as a loss, then the final question isn't about the past. It's about what the past implies about us. Because even now, modern people are still drawn to the same tension. We want authority to feel anchored. We want the world to feel governed by something stable. We want legitimacy to feel more than negotiable. And when it doesn't, we either build stronger institutions or we reach for older stories. We look for the time when the gods were here. So the ancient record might not be telling us what happened in a literal sense. It might be telling us what it feels like when humans inherit the burden of self-rule. And if you listen closely, you can hear that feeling under the clay. Not triumph, not celebration. A kind of quiet dread. A recognition that once the gates close, once authority becomes something we must justify ourselves, there's no going back. Because even if the gods return tomorrow, the world is too big now, too complex, too loud. And that's the final twist, isn't it? Even if you could rewind the story, even if you could imagine a world where kingship descends from heaven, again, in the most literal way possible, would it even work? Could it function in a world that has already expanded past the scale of direct oversight? Because the deeper you go into these texts, the more you realize the ancient writers weren't just describing gods. They were describing the limits of governance. They were describing what happens when a system, any system, faces growth it can't control. And that's why the question survives. Not because it's trendy, not because it's spooky, but because it's structural. Every empire, every institution, every civilization eventually runs into the same pressure: scale, population, complexity, noise. Rigmu. That word from Atrahasis Rigmu keeps echoing because it's not just sound. It's the symptom of a world that has exceeded its container. And in the Mesopotamian record, once that threshold is crossed, the response is catastrophic. Plague, drought, famine, and then the flood. But the flood doesn't restore the earlier world. It ends it. And after that, everything that follows: kings ruling by force, priests interpreting signs, gods becoming distant, looks less like the gods abandoned us and more like the system switched modes. Presence becomes policy. Policy becomes ritual. Ritual becomes memory. And memory becomes the only link left to the old order. So, if you want the most honest conclusion this evidence allows, it's not a definitive identification of the Anunnaki. It's this: the Mesopotamian texts preserve a memory of transition from direct authority to mediated authority, framed as a loss that becomes permanent. And whether you read that direct authority as literal divine presence, as mythic language for early centralized control, or as a remembered ruling elite, the effect is the same. Humanity ends up alone at the steering wheel, not because we won a war against heaven, not because we surpassed the gods in some heroic way, but because the old model couldn't hold. It broke, and it never came back. That's why the Sumerian king list is still one of the strangest documents ever written. It isn't just that it contains impossible numbers, it's that it contains a worldview that refuses to separate myth and history the way we do. It presents the antediluvian kings and the post-flood kings as one continuous administrative sequence. It forces you to confront a simple, uncomfortable idea. To the scribes, the break wasn't between fiction and fact. The break was between two kinds of world: a world where authority is delivered from above, and a world where authority must be justified below. And once you realize that, you understand why later kings obsess over restoration, why they rebuild temples again and again, why they search for foundations, why they cling to ancient names. Because when the gods become memory, the past becomes a source of legitimacy, and legitimacy becomes a constant hunger. So the question at the end of this story isn't, do you believe the gods were real? The question is, what happens to a civilization when the highest source of authority stops speaking plainly? Because once the heavens close, whether literally, symbolically, or institutionally, everything downstream becomes human responsibility. Law becomes the substitute for divine decree. Writing becomes the substitute for divine presence. Ritual becomes the substitute for direct contact. And power becomes a substitute for certainty. That's the post-flood world, and it's still the world we live in. We don't have kings claiming 28,800-year reigns anymore, but we still argue about legitimacy. We still fight over who has the right to rule. We still build institutions to mediate truth. We still tell stories about lost golden ages where authority felt clearer, closer, more grounded. And every time a modern society hits a crisis, every time it feels like the system is failing, you can hear the same ancient anxiety surface. Who is in control? Who decides? Where does authority come from? So maybe the silence of the gods isn't just an ancient mystery. Maybe it's the oldest mirror humans ever held up to themselves. A way of saying, there was once a time when responsibility could be placed elsewhere. On heaven, on the Anunnaki, on gods who managed the world directly. And then something happened. The gates closed. The voice faded, and we inherited the earth. So when the Sumerian king list says, kingship descended from heaven, it's not just describing an origin. It's describing a longing for authority to feel inevitable, for order to feel guaranteed, for someone above to still be watching closely enough to intervene. But the later record, the record of shifting dynasties, endless war, omen reading, and kings digging through ruins, tells a different story. It tells you that whatever once stood at the top of history became unreachable, and that the world became ours to manage. Not perfectly, not peacefully, but permanently. And the last line you're left with the question that hangs in the silence is this. If the gods became stories the moment humans learned to rule themselves, was that the beginning of freedom or the beginning of exile? Either way, the result is the same. The heavens stayed closed, the earth stayed loud, and the responsibility never left our hands.